You know, sometimes I wonder how many people that watched me make videos at the very beginning still occasionally check up on this channel. They might have gotten tired of the Elder Scrolls franchise by now, and I wouldn't blame them. Still, even new audience members can always go back to my older catalog of videos, back when I still followed my very rigid episode numbering structure. Don't misunderstand me though, I'm not telling you this just to reminisce. I'm mostly just interested to know if you've ever seen my old video called Markarth Fetch Quests. It was my 14th cut content episode, give or take. Now, I'm not gonna go and ask you to watch that video first if you haven't. In fact, you really shouldn't. I don't think that early batch of videos still holds up to this day. But hey, what else is new in YouTube land? No, instead I'm gonna be presenting you some enormous new finds today that completely override all that I talked about in that video, marking it as definitively obsolete. These findings would have blown Kid Me's socks off. So for starters, does everyone here know how Skyrim's city-based fetch quests function internally? Well, while the quests are all pretty basic, they do follow a fun naming scheme. This usually being freeform followed by the name of the city and then the number of the quest. Of course, this wouldn't be a Skyrim video if not almost every city had an inconsistent naming scheme. For Whiterun and Falkreath it's freeform, then city name, then quest, then number. Mortal, Markarth, Windhelm and Winterhold have freeform, then city name, then letter. Solitude has city name, then freeform, then number. Riften has freeform, then city name and then number, and Dawnstar doesn't actually have any quests following this radiant scheme. So with that slightly infuriating information now established, I should let you in on another secret. Skyrim's design decisions are sometimes really baffling. For example, just the basic design of NPCs in cities is inconsistent. When people say that places like Riften and Markarth feel different compared to the other vistas in Skyrim, they're not wrong. Objectively, more time was spent creating them, and they were refined at a later date, while all other places were finalized earlier on. Well, actually, Dawnstar also falls under this special treatment umbrella alongside Riften and Markarth. But I feel like people are more likely to forget about Dawnstar due to it not featuring any unique architecture of any kind. Which, incidentally, I feel is also one of the main things holding Winterhold back. While your average NPC in Whiterun or Falkreath is level 4 with an iron dagger, the average NPCs in Riften, Markarth and Dawnstar are actually all level 6 with a leveled dagger instead. Of course, there are sometimes exceptions to this rule overall, but still, isn't this weird? When I say that these three cities got more care and attention, I do mean it though. If you just look at the amount of scenes intertwining the residents and their stories with each other, it honestly feels like these three originate from completely different games. Another very weird quirk, to get back on topic, is just the sheer amount of freeform quests you can do. In almost all cities, you have about 4 or 5 to complete, give or take. Iverstead has more freeform quests than Windhelm, for example. While Riften actually has 22 different freeform quests. Its Stain quest is also present under this naming scheme as it doesn't use the same radiant questing dialogue or setup like the others do. But if Riften has so many freeform quests, then how many does Markarth have? You probably don't remember there being that many, right? And maybe a couple of them got cut. It isn't really unheard of. I mean, both Falkreath and Winterhold had their total of 3 cut down to just 1 due to quest removal. It's sad, but it happens. Yeah, well, Markarth actually had 9 different quests cut from it. Oh, excuse me, did I say 9? What I meant to say was, the final game has leftovers for 9 different cut quests remaining, but I actually found evidence of a 10th one as well. Yeah. Here's a visual representation of exactly which quests made it into the final game and which did not. Just in case the sheer amount of content cut here hasn't quite sunk in, these cut freeform quests are more numerous than the ones for Winterhold, Windhelm and Whiterun combined. Sadly, in the final game's files there are basically no remains to be found of whatever these quests were once meant to be. You get a leftover script here, a single item name there, but that's mostly it. And my original video didn't really go much further than that. I had these scraps that I could speculate about, but nothing else. And you know that I hate simply speculating. Well, while I was working on the dialogue views video, I stumbled across something big. Like, really big. I randomly just found all the dialogue related to one of these cut quests. I was super happy. That was a big find, you know? I remembered how there's basically nothing left of the quests, and we've gone from basically nothing to basically knowing everything. And then I tempted fate. What if there was more, you know? I just had to look. And then I found more. And more. And more. Almost every single quest. Almost every last one of them that was but mere scraps had all of its dialogue still fully present for me to read. That's when I knew that this beast I had found would need to get its own video. Otherwise, I'd have my own little Markarth subsection completely buried in a bigger video, and that's not something I'd want to do. So, now that I no longer have to merely speculate, why don't you join me in discussing these findings, starting from the top with Freeform Markarth A. Quest A here is actually one of the few that doesn't contain any dialogue in the dialogue views, but as far as I'm aware, that's due to a different reason than most. This is also one of the easier quests to imagine, as we've basically got all the info we need just from its leftovers. You see, Quest A still exists in the form of 3 script pieces. The first is called Freeform Markarth A script, and said script basically tells us everything we need to know. It has code in it that calculates how much gold the player would receive for selling Dwemer parts to Kolgrim, the Dwemer researcher located in Understone Keep. Besides the gold reward, selling these parts to Kolgrim would also increase his disposition with you. Now, if this all sounds vaguely familiar, I'll tell you why. You do actually sell Dwemer parts to Kolgrim in the final game. However, doing so isn't part of a freeform quest. Rather, it's a radiant world interaction, despite, not being all that radiant. This finalized quest, simply known as Buy Dwarven Artifact, is internally known as WI at item 07. The WI there stands for World Interaction. The quote-unquote interaction you would have with the world here would be picking up a random Dwemer artifact. Oh, and if you're wondering about the world interaction quests, stealing something owned by an NPC and getting tugs sent after you belongs to the same series of quests, for example. I know that saying this is just speculating once again, but I honestly feel like the dialogue from Quest A was just lifted or copied wholesale and reused for WI at item 07. It just seems too easy of an explanation to ignore. It's not like Bethesda have never done this either. In Oblivion they took out a miscellaneous quest for Coral and repurposed it as the local Mages Guild quest. That's not just speculation either. Internal data genuinely shows that they did do that. In this case, I don't have such a smoking gun here, but I'm pretty close. The other 2 scripts tied to this quest are smaller ones. This one is still used, but it doesn't really tell us much, since it mentions both Quest A and E, and it's still used by the latter. This second script holds no information for us either, but it is notable due to it also still being used. And not by a quest. No, this script is still actually tied to Kolgrim's museum dialogue in the final game. So if I were to put a conclusion here, I feel like it's pretty safe to say that Quest A and WI at item 07 are one and the same, if not fundamentally almost identical. Moving on to Quest B now. This one has no leftovers in the final game at all. Luckily for us then, do the dialogue views come in clutch here. Quest B would involve Kosnak, the drunken porter who works for Lisbeth of Ornleven Sons. You could have asked Kosnak about the problem with the shipments, to which he'd reveal that he actually steals from the shipments that do come in and sells items to his friends. If the 2 of you were friends, he would also be willing to sell to you, though his exact inventory is unknown. There are also lines present he would have used if you tried discussing his scheme at the store. On their own, these aren't that noteworthy, until you remember that Kosnak normally doesn't ever set foot inside of the store. He's either at the Warrens or at the inn, never at his supposed workplace. Oh, and there's also a line for Lisbeth where you could have exposed Kosnak's scheme to her. It's unknown what the exact repercussions would have been though. Quest C is quite a tease. In the game's files there's only a single script remaining. This script has a single relevant line of code as well as a note to go alongside it. Both mention a scene of Talos worship. Knowing that hidden Talos worship in the city is still a problem in the final game, this setup was intriguing, but alas, we knew nothing more. Now with the dialogue views, we know a lot more of course. Apparently this quest would have been started by talking to Ondolamor, the Talmor Justiciar. Asking him about his group would have had him mention the ban on Talos worship. And while this isn't just your average quest starter, it seems that this would give you a vague objective. With objective or without, you would have to go to Ogmund's house. Inside, you'd come across a scene of, well, you guessed it, Talos worship. It seems that Ogmund had a shrine inside his house and that he, alongside other worshippers, would have been found there. Ogmund has dialogue explaining himself, and the other worshippers also have some lines showing you were most certainly not welcome there. While most dialogue just refers to the others as worshippers, there are some specific lines that mention Lisbeth was also meant to be found worshipping here. You could then report your findings to Indolamar, but it's unknown what would have happened next. Still, I find it pretty weird that this quest was cut, but Quest M was kept in, seeing as they basically have the same setup, although Quest M is said setup on a lesser scale. Next, Quest F. Quest F had 2 remaining scripts left in the files. One that mentions a property for the player having read a letter, and another tracking whether or not the player has read a letter. Anyways, we knew that this quest involved a letter, but that's about it. The dialogue views revealed that this quest would have been a follow-up to Lisbeth's Quest E, Lisbeth's missing shipment. In this quest, she would be happy that business is getting better, and she would ask you to deliver a letter to Betterit Silverblood. This letter contains some bad news, and upon delivering it, Betterit would not be happy. She would also ask you whether or not you have read the letter, but that ultimately doesn't matter. Report back to Lisbeth, who is quite happy with how things turned out. Now, if I may just have a second here in order to speculate a bit about the contents of the letter, seeing as we don't actually have those. I feel like this letter would have contained info among the lines of "I will no longer be needing any of your money in order to keep my store afloat." But I also feel like money wouldn't have just been the sole motivator here. Lisbeth is also marked as a secret lover of Tonar Silverblood, head honcho of the family, and the husband of Betterit. So I feel like it either would have been "I no longer need money, so I won't be fucking your husband any longer," or "I no longer need money, and by the way, I was fucking your husband behind your back." But again, this is all just speculation. I can't confirm anything. Oh, and a fun fact here, I was looking through the official game guide in order to check if there were some leftovers written about there that maybe tie into this quest or its lore. Well, no, there weren't, but what I did find was mention of a person at a treasury house known as Kolgrim, whose name isn't mentioned in either the creation kit or the dialogue views. So there's that. Now onto Quest G. Quest G actually has 16 different mentions in various scripts, though none of them are all that substantial. The only relevant piece of info you need to know is that almost each time Quest G is mentioned alongside the generic favor quest Favor 017, also known as Few Words With You. Now, this quest is one of the many Radiant quest setups in the final game. Maybe you don't even notice this being a Radiant system when playing, but alas, the short walkthrough of this quest as seen on the UESP tells you all you need to know. It's just the basic talk to the quest giver, find out who they want you to speak with, whatever, persuade, bribe, intimidate or brawl with them, and return to the quest giver. The quest between Carlotta Valencia and Mikael is part of this system, but so is the one between Octave San and Ernskar Ironhand, and most notably between the smelter worker Omloag in Markarth and his boss, Mullish Grow Sugars. If we look up the quest name in the dialogue views, we'll find that, yup, just as I expected. Quest G is basically just the same as the Favor 017 variation between Mullish and Omloag. Now, not all dialogue is word for word the same. There are a couple of minor differences to the player lines, and Omloag's rejection line is different. But for all intents and purposes, Quest G was just repurposed wholesale. Quest H now. This was also always one of the ones that intrigued me. Its only remnant was just an item name for Nana Ildine's medicine. This is especially cool seeing as Nana Ildine is just a mostly inconsequential NPC in the final game. This quest would have been triggered by asking Nana about her name. And I'm so glad to tell you that the Nana part is just a nickname like I've always thought. She tells you about her duties around the treasure house and asks you to deliver medicine to Degain, also giving him a bit of backstory along the way. Degain will act as a bitter plant, but Nana will tell you to ignore his comments and stays positive throughout. Two things that I want to mention here. What boy does Nana mean? I mean, she also refers to Degain as a boy, despite him clearly being an older man, so I suppose she means Tonar? I guess that would make sense, her always having been his nanny. And secondly, while she is nothing more than an inconsequential NPC in the final game, we will be seeing more of Nana, so keep this happy old woman characterization in the back of your mind. Quest I. This quest is pretty similar to the last actually. It too only remains in the form of an item name in the final game. Yueli's sleeping potion. Just like Ildine, Yueli is a Forsworn agent whose cover is being a maid for an influential Markarth citizen. You also normally only have a notable encounter with her during the Forsworn conspiracy quest, at which point she'd also be about 2 minutes away from her death at your hands. Alternatively, if you visited the house while not on the quest, Yueli would just turn you away and not actually give you the time of day in order to discuss a quest. You were originally meant to ask about her work though, which would result in her explaining that she only started working for Nepos in order to repay a debt she accumulated by getting him to lower her father's sentence. You know, her father, Huracan, he actually still mentions her being his daughter in the final game.
I left behind my daughter, Uale, when I was taken. How old is my daughter now, I wonder? In prison, you lose track of time.
Of course, this normally means nothing to you, as at that point there's a 90% chance you have already killed Yueli. Still, nice try, Bethesda. Now, Yueli would request you retrieve a sleeping potion from Botella's shop, the Hex Cure, stating that Nepos needs it in order to fall asleep. And she also adds that if he can't sleep, she's not gonna have a comfortable night's rest either. Now, you may think that this implies she's also his caretaker, but nope. Botella actually implies Yueli gives him the potion because he assaults her otherwise. Yay for good content? Jeez, Bethesda. I'm not even mad. I'm just surprised at where you went with this. Dark stuff. Quest K. This quest has no leftovers whatsoever in the final game, so we're headed straight for the dialogue. Said dialogue also seems to be incomplete though. While most of it is here, the dialogue that was actually meant to start the quest doesn't appear to be present. You would have started the quest by talking to Betred Silverblood, and you would have delivered a letter to Klepper at the Silverblood Inn. Other specifics are unknown, although it seems that Betred would give you the opportunity to do work for Tonar in the future. And now we've arrived at Quest M, or should I say Quest Line M, as for some reason this random quest has 2 direct follow-ups marked, Quest M2 and M3. This is a quirk unique to these quests, as none of the other city quests have this distinction. Also, they're not quite follow-ups, but we'll get to that. Remember when I mentioned Search and Seizure, the quest where you find evidence of Ogmund's Talos worship in the final game? Well, it appears that that quest didn't exist at this point. So I'm even more certain now that said quest was purely made to repurpose that original cut idea. Well, it's either that, or Quest M and Quest M1 are different entities entirely. But again, Bethesda and inconsistent internal naming are like yin and yang. One can't exist without the other. Let me tell you this though, if you thought Yueli's quest was a doozy, wait until you hear this. So Quest M1 apparently involved finding a note in Omlueg's room in the Warrens. This note would detail a plot that included blowing up the smelter. Yes, apparently Omlueg was working with the Forsworn and they tasked him with blowing up the smelter at his workplace. You could then bring the note to Omlueg to dissuade him from going through with his plan, citing innocent deaths. He would also explain his plan in what I feel is one of the coolest lines here, implying Nana Eldin is indeed one of the more dangerous Forsworn puppet heads and her niceness really is all a cover. Instead of talking to Omlueg, you could have also shown this note to a guard, but the exact consequences of doing so are once again unknown. Okay, and now I'm gonna have to pump the brakes a bit. Before we're gonna move on, this may all sound a bit like a big conspiracy, right? A Forsworn conspiracy even. And if you were thinking that, then guess what? You're completely on the mark. It seems that MS-01, the Forsworn conspiracy, was at one point connected to these 3 random quests. When you met Eltris at the Talos Shrine originally, he would have explained the leads he had gathered on the conspiracy's most involved people. One was on Omlueg, one on Yueli, and one on Eldin. Notice the use of the early Silverfish name here as well, rather than the finalized Silverblood. Each of these leads corresponds to one of the M quests, which, I gotta admit, is really cool, if not a weird way to design it. There's also a small handful of mentions that appear to instead refer to these quests as MS-01A, B and C quests respectively, which makes a lot more sense in my eyes, but alas, I'm not Bethesda. The relevant quest script also reveals some more cool info, such as there being a scene between Omlueg and Hatrasil tied to this quest. Hatrasil actually has dialogue for asking him about the relevant conversation, though this doesn't amount to much. There's also a variable to track if Eltris has asked the player to bring the smelter plans, which is cool if not somewhat confusing, as there is no relevant dialogue to be found for this anywhere. which leads me to believe that this might have been an objective for an even earlier iteration of the quest. Then there are some references to a sluice key, and I am very thankful for those, as the existence of that key is one of the mysteries I set out to solve years ago, and now I finally can. The key referenced by this script actually still exists. It's called Sluice Gate Key, and has the internal name of MS01 Omluag Key. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the key can actually still be found in the final game. Yeah, someone just left it in there, didn't disable it or nothing. Of course, it doesn't actually open anything, and it isn't even tied to anything, but still, the key is there. You wanna know something funny though? The specific instance of this key placed in the smelter overseer's house has a unique name as well. Wanna know what it is? It's actually MS01A Smelter Plans Ref. Okay, so what does that all mean? Well, that's a good question. In my head, it likely went something like this. Originally, the sabotage would have been far grander than just blowing up the smelter. Instead, the plan was to either flood it or flood the entire lower side of Markarth by opening some kind of sluice gate. Important to note is that something like that doesn't even exist in the final game's Markarth, by the way. The smelter plans confuse me, because it doesn't seem to be Omluag's plans for sabotaging the smelter, but rather the actual blueprints for the smelter itself. I suppose that these could have been used for finding out where an explosion was likely, and as such are part of the later iteration? I don't fully know. It seems that ultimately though, a note was meant to be found in Omluag's room instead, which would have set off the events of confronting him, and that the smelter plans were either completely discarded, or they are tied to something of which no information remains at all. Okay, we got all that? Good. Then we can move on to quest M2, and I don't think you're quite ready for this one either, but still. So, like Eltris's dialogue told us, this one involves Ildeen. In the final game, there are 3 markers left that already set the scene. Literally even. As one is a scene marker and the other 2 are location markers for the people involved. In this specific instance, that would mean Nana Ildeen and Batella from the Hex Cure. Fun fact, this scene is set up to play outside in the city somewhere, while neither woman ever leaves their respective abode in the final game. Whatever the scene would have entailed, it seems that Ildeen would have handed Batella some kind of note. You would then try and talk Batella into giving you said note. Batella wouldn't really resist, but she would have revealed herself as another pawn of the Forsworn on the outside. And why would she be doing this? Well, because of her nephew, Odvan, being locked up in Sidna Mine, as he's a part of the Forsworn. Just like Yueli, she tries to help the Forsworn in order to secure his release. Also similar to Yueli's case is the fact that this familial tie still gets brought up in the final game, although it once more doesn't mean anything there, as it doesn't serve any more purpose than a bit of background storytelling.
Bothella, I have a question.
You want to know a secret of mine, young girl? The most effective poison to kill a man? A potion to make others fall in love, perhaps?
I was actually just wondering if you had any family.
Oh, I see.
I'm sorry. You don't have to tell me if you don't.
I have one, a nephew. He's in prison for being a member of the Forsworn.
Funny enough, Odvan also mentions Batella, although in his greeting he calls her Grandma Batella instead.
I wonder how Grandma Bathella is doing. She's probably worried sick about me.
Despite this, he still mentions his unnamed aunt in his backstory, so he likely also means Batella there, and the greeting was just mistaken.
Guards say I murdered someone. I was just sleeping off some meat in my aunt's house, but that didn't stop them from arresting me.
And while this is never explicitly stated as false or otherwise, Batella's unused dialogue also seems to imply that Odvan was indeed falsely accused of being a member of the Forsworn. Now, after getting the note from Batella, you'd have some more options. Either A, report to a guard, note the silverfish here once more, or B, go and confront Ildeen with the information. If you went to confront Ildeen, she would at first keep up her positive facade, but it wouldn't be long before she shows her true colors. It seems that she would have some dialogue for certain topics both in and out of her cover. And again, what follows is just, in my opinion, really well written dialogue that gives an insight in her character, and why she aids the Forsworn. It's about 52 million times better than how she was used in the final game, which is to say she wasn't. Oh, and just like Omluag, she would have just give you one final hint involving the other person you're supposed to follow up on. In this case, that's Yueli. I also completely forgot to address this earlier, but Eldris's earlier dialogue refers to her as the maid at the treasury house, while in the final game she's actually the maid at Nepos' house, and she doesn't ever set foot in the treasury house itself. But now it's time for this to become even more convoluted. Remember the quote-unquote alternate names for these quests under the MSO1 banner? Well, MSO1B still has some leftovers as well, but they don't really tie into M2, but rather into M3, which I'll get to right after this of course. We actually have only one leftover that isn't a script, and that's a marker called MSO1B Ueli Nepos trigger. This trigger isn't actually used, but it would have been used to start some kind of scene, as shown by the related quest script. Now, this script actually holds a ton of super interesting details, basically spelling out the quest for us. So after the scene between Ueli and Nepos, you would have gone out and searched for Degain the Beggar. There are also variables tracking for if the player knows about Urakan from Degain, and if Urakan is free. Now remember, Urakan is Ueli's father who has been locked up in Sidna Mine for years. What's also interesting are the variables tracking if Degain is following you in this little property called Poison. Whatever the case here, it doesn't seem like Degain was gonna like it. Of course, this all sounds like a cool setup, but it's sad that no dialogue for it remains. Wait a minute, so here's all of Degain's quest relevant dialogue. Yup, it's just that easy now. Okay, so based on what I can find in the dialogue views, it's likely that Nepos and Ueli would have been talking about her father and about his jail sentence. With this info, you could then ask Ueli herself about her father and she'd elaborate on what happened. You would have then gone to the Jarl's housecarl in order to find out why exactly he was jailed. There's even dialogue written for both the original housecarl and his Stormcloak replacement. You would get a report from the original crime, which would have showed you that Degain was the person whose testimony got Urakan locked up. Upon talking to that dirty skeever of a man, you can find out that it was indeed all a setup, and that Nepos the Nose paid Degain to make a false confession because he's into Ueli. Oh boy, I was really waiting for that pervert storyline to poke its ugly head back up. No, in all seriousness, I think the way this is set up is actually really good and believable. And I'm happy that they didn't shy away from this characterization after a single mission like what's usually the case in Skyrim. Now, after getting Degain to admit his lie to you, you would then take him to the Jarl himself and he would retract his previous statement, making the Jarl decide to release Urakan. Again, even the Jarl himself has dialogue for this, written for both Igmund and Tongvor. And finally, you could then report your success to Ueli, whose dialogue includes one of the biggest bombshells I've read in all of this. Seriously, reading this made me audibly yell out, "What?" when I discovered it. She states, "You proved father was innocent? Oh, thank you. Thank you. We can leave Markarth now, together. Maybe Uncle Ainatach will let us stay at his home in Carthwasten. I'm sure he will." She's related to Ainatach? What? Urakan's his brother, I suppose? That would also make them kinda related to Rondek and Voeda. That's just an insanely cool detail. How this all would have tied back into the overall plot? I don't know. I don't even know if this quest and Quest M3 were meant to exist concurrently. But hey, it wouldn't really surprise me. So how about that Quest M3, right? Well, similar to the two before it, you could have snooped around and found that Ueli's diary contained clues that showed you that she had plans to kill Nepos the Nose. You know how this goes, right? You could turn in the diary to the guards, or you could have confronted Ueli with it. Once again, this would result in the option of giving it back without incident for the required info, or she would attack you for it. Ueli would have some kind of well-written dialogue explaining her motives about her falsely imprisoned father and the fact that Nepos abuses her, which is why she was planning on killing him. She would also explain to you that Ildeen got her roped into the whole conspiracy, and explains, I think for the first time now, that Madanach, the Forsworn King, runs the whole show from inside Sidna Mine. But before I'm gonna go deeper into this rabbit hole that keeps on expanding, I first wanna address something. Have you been wondering about how the victims of this conspiracy were feeling? Well, besides confronting the respective conspirators and the guards with your newly found info, you also had a third option, and that's informing the victims. Yes, they were really thinking that far ahead. I'm amazed too. And while the dialogue doesn't specify a speaker, they can be deduced from context alone, I feel like. Omluag's victim would have been Mulush, and he would have been understandably upset. Ueli's victim would have been Nepos, and he would have been in for quite a surprise. I originally wanted to say that his dialogue sounds uncharacteristic, but then I realized that the final game doesn't characterize him in the first place, so that's all fine and dandy. Ildine's victim, though, is a bit of an odd case. Here is their response. Can you tell me who this is supposedly from? Whoever it was, they were meant to be a parent to Tonar Silverblood. My guess? This line originally belonged to Betrit, who was meant to be his mother rather than his wife. I don't have anything for that except circumstantial evidence, but still. Oh, and remember when I said this in my past dialogue views video? I was looking for a mention of Raylov's different Talmor bitch line when I stumbled across an even bigger content rabbit hole. But that's not for now. Yeah, that refers to this exact line, including the word bitch. So just imagine my surprise when out of context I find someone referring to Tonar Silverblood as their son as part of some dialogue I've never seen before. So I went looking and I found more and more and more, and that's how we ended up with this video. All from this one line essentially. Crazy, right? So before we move on to No One Escapes from Sidna Mine, internally known as MSO2, which follows up directly after the Forsworn Conspiracy quest proper, there are still some things I need to mention. One of which of course being MSO1C. Now there isn't a lot remaining of whatever this quest was once supposed to be. It does involve one of the other mysteries I set out to solve though, and that's the mystery of these two barrels. They are internally known as MSO1C Riada's wardrobe and MSO1C Ildine's wardrobe. Both containers are completely empty and unused. Besides the relevant quest script, nothing remains of the quest in the files. And the script itself isn't as enlightening as its predecessors. Its only noteworthy inclusion is a property for a scene involving Ildine. Based on the containers, it might have also involved Riada, but that's just a guess. Even the dialogue views can't really clear this one up, as while they do contain internal names for the dialogue topics, there's no actual dialogue to be found. The topic names are as follows: MSO1C Ildine Greed Branch, MSO1C Ildine Questions Conspiracy, and MSO1C Eltrist Talk Branch. So whatever this quest once entailed, you would have spoken to Eltrist and Ildine during it. But that's about all that can be said about it for sure. I don't know what we would have possibly wanted with the two women's wardrobes. This is wishful thinking, but just maybe this quest would have had Eltrist and Riada acknowledge each other's existence? If you don't know, and I wouldn't blame you, Riada and Eltrist are actually married and are even expecting a child together. But the two never mention each other. The closest Eltrist ever comes to mentioning this is in his introductory dialogue from the Forsworn Conspiracy.
I've been trying to find out why ever since. Gotten nowhere so far. And then I got married. Have a child of my own on the way.
While Riada will never mention the relation to you at all. It's only ever brought up in this conversation she has with Tonar. And the chance of you hearing this is very slim.
You're a very pretty young woman, Riada.
Why, thank you, Thonar. I'm flattered.
You're married, yes? To that young metal worker?
Eltrist, yes. Just last season we were wed.
He's a lucky man to have such a beautiful young wife.
Now, I would love to be able to explain this inconsistency away with more unused dialogue, but that's not possible. This seems to just be a writing oversight. Or they just never got around to fleshing out a relationship. Or maybe they didn't think it would be relevant. Still, sad to see something I can't solve with the dialogue views like this. So, do you think we're done yet? Nope. First, we need to make a quick stop at the Markarth stables, as for some reason there's dialogue for asking both Cedron and I assume Banning if the Forsworn ever came to them asking for horses. I don't know where exactly this would have tied in, as I haven't found any dialogue in relation to these lines, but still, interesting tidbit nonetheless. I find it especially weird seeing Cedron already mentioned as a stable master here, when it's clear that at one point he was meant to be the bard at the Silverblood Inn. So that's an ancient leftover apparently. Okay, now we can resume our delving. So in the final game you would go to meet Eltrist at the shrine as usual, but you'd find him murdered. A guard would then ambush and arrest you. Originally it seems that Eltrist instead just wasn't present, and you would have been ambushed by Nepos the Nose himself. Yes, the old man apparently was more mobile than we first thought. And you know, due to the previous quest playing out like they did, he's also a lot more alive than usual at this point. And after getting this unique dialogue from Nepos, you'd be thrown in Sidna Mine just like you are in the final game. Seems there was a single removed line here for Uriken that would have mentioned Urzoga by name. That might not sound too interesting to you, but she's never addressed by name in the final game, so yeah. Speaking of Urzoga, she would also play a bigger role in this quest. At some point, I assume before speaking to Madanach, you would encounter her as she killed another prisoner, Bladlock. She would explain that Bladlock was actually an informant she was using in order to catch Madanach in the act of escaping. But now with your arrival, she didn't need him anymore. She would also mention the fact that everyone is aware of Madanach's escape plans, but she needs to catch him in the act in order to strengthen her case. More importantly, strengthen her case in order to convince Nepos the Nose, who apparently really did play a bigger overall role here. Now, you may be wondering who Bladlock is, and well, based on internal data, he was either turned into or was an earlier name of the prisoner you encounter in the final game, Braig. I wonder just how different their characters would have been, as Urzoga calls him a killer, while he himself states that he's an innocent victim in the final game. Him being an innocent victim is also like his whole point in the story, so I don't know what the truth here was. I suppose you can decide on that for yourself. One thing of note here is that you could also ask Urzoga for the key to let Borkul out of his cell, so I suppose he was originally meant to be locked up rather than guarding the gate to Madanach. Actually, the corresponding dialogue with Borkul reveals that the task likely came from Madanach himself, so you likely would have met him before Borkul, and getting him loose was likely one of the last steps before you all broke out together. But how this earlier iteration would have played out is otherwise unknown, as there is no more relevant dialogue to be found for any of the prisoners, including Madanach himself, nor Urzoga. I mean, Madanach's line about Grisvor was a tiny bit different, but it doesn't give us any specific clues about any other alterations. What is different though is what would have happened after you escaped. Instead of being confronted by Tonar, you would have instead been met by Nepos the Nose. Also notable is the fact that he only has dialogue for congratulating you on taking out the Forsworn menace, so it's possible that aiding the Forsworn wasn't yet implemented, and that was only thought of later. If the quest reward and the follow-up for the Forsworn members are anything to go by in the final game, I think that's a completely accurate assumption to make. Oh, and don't worry, I didn't forget about the freeform quest from which this video started. They just happened to intersect nicely with the other unused stuff, just as there were no more unused freeform quests. Lucky break, huh? Now, of course, I could continue pointing out how Riada's dialogue saw more minor changes, and Ugman's, which has some ramifications. I already mentioned Gorza's being changed previously, and then there's also Cedran's whole deal, Reberus's weird race debacle, the removed Cinnamine portion, whatever was the original intent with Logrolf, and the fact that Roki likely absorbed Betrid's market scenes, and then Tonar and Ingvar the Singer being meant to go to the inn, but I have to call it quits somewhere, you know. I have exhaustively looked at all the cut quests here, as well as how they were meant to tie into the overarching quest of the city. That's what I set out to do, and I'm happy that I've had the chance to do so. But now I'm still left with that lingering question. Why in the world was this all unused? You know, I usually do a quick recap and state that it's either a good cut or a bad cut, and I speculate on the reason for its removal. But be honest with me, did I mention anything here today that didn't sound like an objective improvement over what we got in the final game? Cutting all this stuff after putting so much thought and effort into it also doesn't seem logical, in any sense. Which leads me to conclude that the only way they would have had to do this was because of time crunch. You know, just keep either the personal favorites or the quests that were furthest along and leave the others in the dust. I can't fathom any other reason for so many quests which were fully written to get chopped. I hope that maybe this video's existence makes a developer talk about it, but at the end of the day, I'm just left completely baffled. Even more so than with other cuts. I mean, take Bwitia's bidding. Yeah, that was big, but ultimately it's just one quest. The pit? Yeah, that's a real big cut, but at the end of the day, no one is really missing it. Some people might not even know it existed. This though? I feel like these cuts single-handedly brought down not only Markarth and its lore, but also the whole point of the Forsworn. In the final game, what we saw of the original intent was literally just a fraction. Seriously, I've never felt this before, and it's just so weird, as none of the other cities even come close to this kind of design philosophy to have their minor and major quests weave into one another and all fit in with an overarching theme about a specific region. Not even its sister city Riften does it like this. I mean, it could have, and it has the potential to, but it's clear that they did not want to attempt such an undertaking. The only other halt that comes close to this is Winterhold, and you know how that turned out. I don't think I've ever said this, but with Markarth, Old Roldan and Dushnik Jarl all having this content basically left over, I'd say, modders, you know what to do. Do you think I might have missed something or overlooked something noteworthy? Did you learn something here today that you wish you hadn't? Please let me know in the comments. If I ever recover from this huge blow to my heart, I'll be sure to reply. I've been UnknownG, and I wish you all a good day.